As of the recording of this video, the United States is in $37.2 trillion of debt. That's right, $37.2 trillion of debt. That's an almost inconceivable amount of money. But who is the United States in debt to? If you've ever asked that question, then this video is going to attempt to answer that very critical question. Who does the United States owe all of this money to? I remember being a kid and seeing, the debt numbers going up and just wondering, like, how is a whole country in such an incredible amount of debt? So let's explore that right now. So first and foremost, let me just show you where you can find this information for yourself. The first and most up-to-date source is the U.S. Debt Clock, and that's at usdebtclock.org. Now, there's a lot of numbers on the screen. I really encourage you to check this website out because it's a lot of good information. Top left quadrant of the screen, you'll see the U.S. national debt, and you see that number ticking up pretty quickly. It's at $37.17 trillion right now. What you'll also see right below that is U.S. federal spending, which is currently at $7.21 trillion. Okay, and that's for this fiscal year. Now, if you look over to the right, you'll see my cursor right here. It shows U.S. federal tax revenue. So that's the primary way that the United States generates revenue. It's not the only way, but it's the primary way. So if you look at how much revenue the United States approximately has pulled in this year, 5.2 in tax revenue. And if you look at how much they've spent, 7.2, and both of these are in trillions of dollars, you'll see that there's a deficit there. There's a gap between how much they've spent and how much they brought in tax revenue. And it's about a $2 trillion gap. Now, there are some other sources of revenue that can kind of fill in that gap. But the point is, there's a gap. The point is, there's a deficit. And that's why the United States has to create more debt to account for that deficit, which kind of doesn't make sense. It's like you're in debt, so you create more debt to get out of debt. And so you can kind of see how this is a really interesting spiral that the country is in. And that's the result of being on a fiat currency system, which we'll talk about in another video soon. Now, another source of information where you can see the level of debt that the United States is in or holds is at the Federal Reserve website, specifically Fred, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. And they have all of this information right here online. And as you can see, total public debt has billions of dollars. Is at $36 million, which is 36 trillion. You can see right here, as of June 3rd, 2025. So about a month ago or so, as of the recording of this video, month and a half or so, we were at $36 trillion in debt, and now we're at 37. So the amount of debt is increasing exponentially because the more debt we get, the higher the interest on the debt, the faster the debt grows. Plus you have like legislation like the Big Beautiful Bill that encourages more spending that hasn't hit the streets yet, but it will soon. And you can see how this thing can pile up pretty quickly. So here we have two different representations of federal debt. You have kind of like this stagnant chart that's based on data as of June 3rd. And then you have the U.S. debt clock giving you up to the second updates on where we are with our debt. So then the question is, okay, how does this debt thing work? So in a real basic way, because the United States is not bringing in enough revenue to cover their expenditures, they have to issue debt in order to have more money in order to spend more money, right? So the way that the United States does that is through the Treasury. They issue bonds. Now, maybe you hold bonds in your 401k. Maybe you hold them in your brokerage account. Bonds, treasuries, these types of investment vehicles are regarded across the planet as one of the safest investment vehicles because they are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States, meaning the United States would literally have to file for bankruptcy, completely blow up, go defunct in order to not make the payments. And up to this point, the United States has never missed a payment on its debt obligations, be it bonds and treasuries and notes, etc. So how does this debt get into the system? How does the United States create this debt? Well, what they do is through the Treasury, they write IOUs, which we call bonds and treasuries and notes, but they're just an IOU. Think of a piece of paper that says IOU, and it has a nominal value and it has like a coupon rate. So it has the amount you pay for it, and then it has the amount of interest you earn. So the United States says, hey, who wants this IOU? And a bank or a foreign government or an individual like you and I says, hey, I want it. I want to earn yield. So you go and you exchange your fiat currency, your dollars, and you get this IOU from the government. So the government gets your dollars, which they can spend, and you get this IOU, this bond. And so what the government does is they pay you interest on your bond at regular intervals. And when the term of that bond is up, whether it's a couple of months, couple of years, couple of decades, the government will give you back what you paid for the bond. And that's basically how it works. And so the government can create as many of these bonds as it wants, which means as long as there's a demand on the market for these bonds, it can bring in more cash. So they create debt instruments, bonds, they sell them in the market, and sometimes they get bought on a secondary market. People or institutions or corporations or in all of the above buy these bonds, and then the money they use to buy the bonds goes into the government coffers. The government can then use that money to spend on public services, whether they're building roads or bridges or whatever they're doing with the money, which sometimes it's kind of hard to decipher. So that's, in a nutshell, what government debt is. Now, the Treasury, through the Office of Debt Management, they're the ones that kind of monitor this system, how many bonds will be created, etc. The total federal debt, which you see right here, that is comprised of debt held by the public and debt held by intergovernmental agencies. Those two things together equals the total debt. Now, when I say the public, I do mean you and I, individuals, anyone who chooses to add a bond to their portfolio. But the public also includes corporations, state and local governments, federal banks, Federal Reserve banks, foreign governments, and other entities. So all of that makes up the public. So let's break that down a little bit. So I already talked about you and I. You and I can go to the Treasury website and we can buy bonds directly. You can hold them in your brokerage account, etc. But the Federal Reserve also holds a significant amount of U.S. debt. And so how does that work? Well, first and foremost, the Federal Reserve is a quasi-private bank. Like, it's basically a private bank, but it's kind of not, because it was started by some legislation. So it's a murky kind of relationship between the Fed and the United States government, which is kind of why, even though President Trump is so displeased with Jerome Powell's performance, or his perception of Jerome Powell's performance, he still can't fire him, right? So the Federal Reserve, what they can do is they can literally create money out of thin air. That's exactly what I said. I meant that. Like, they can literally create money out of thin air. You'll hear somebody say, a lot of people say printing money, and they really don't have a printing press. They just create this money on a computer screen. And so the way the process works is the government's like, hey, we need more money. And they create these IOUs. And a lot of times the Fed is the buyer of those IOUs. And you might have heard the term quantitative easing, or QE. And during that process is when the Fed adds to its balance sheet by creating money literally out of thin air. It then transfers that money to commercial banks. These banks hold treasuries and bonds on their balance sheet. And then it buys those bonds from the commercial banks. So it's kind of like you taking money from your checking account, ACHing it to somebody, just sending it directly from your account to theirs, and then sending you a product. That's basically how the Fed acquires bonds from the United States government, but it's through an indirect kind of method. So think of your bank that you bank with, whether it says Bank of America. Bank of America holds a ton of bonds on its balance sheet. So what the Fed might do is say, hey, we want to buy $100 million worth of bonds. And so what they'll do is they'll just create $100 million on their computer, and then they'll just zap that $100 million to Bank of America. Now Bank of America has $100 million more dollars in their Federal Reserve account. The Fed has an account at all of the banks. Then Bank of America will send the Federal Reserve $100 million worth of bonds. And that is how the Federal Reserve adds to its balance sheet by buying the debt, because that debt that it bought is now an asset because it's generating interest on its purchase, because the United States has to pay interest to anyone who holds those bonds. Now Bank of America has $100 million more dollars in its coffers. So if you saw one of my prior videos, banks can do what's called fractional reserve lending. So for every $1 that they have in their accounts, they can lend out $9 or $10. So now Bank of America can issue more loans to you and I, to businesses, etc. They can also buy more bonds from the United States government and earn yield on those bonds. And so when the president is saying he wants interest rates lower, when interest rates are lower, it makes it easier for this process to be facilitated. And so that's really one of the things he's asking Jerome Powell to do, is start quantitative easing so that more money floods into the economy, so that more money floods into the stock market, so the price of the stocks goes up. It also means that if the interest rates are lower, then the interest payments on the debt will be lower, because you remember the debt clock going up and up and up and up and up and up so quickly. That will help to ensure that the United States won't default on its debt, because if it defaults, then all of the bonds all around the world that other governments, other foreign central banks, all of these entities are holding, they will immediately want to get rid of those instruments, and that would be cataclysmic, not only for the United States, but for the world economy, because so many economies are reliant on the United States to thrive. So, in addition to the debt held by the public, you have debt held by agencies and trusts. So this one is really interesting because, as you can see, this is a little bit behind, but as of June 3rd, there was $7.3 or so trillion held by agencies or trusts. So one example of like what that means is, think of Social Security. Now, the Social Security Administration has a mandate. It is obligated by law to take any extra monies that it has. So, for example, when you get paid, they're taking Social Security out of your paycheck, putting it into the Social Security Administration's coffers. And also in that same time period, there are people who have already retired who are collecting their Social Security checks. So if there is a surplus, say for instance, Social Security gets $1 billion in for that pay period, but they only have to pay out $500 million. They are obligated to take that surplus of $500 million and do what? Buy bonds. And isn't that convenient? Because now that creates demand for the U.S. debt. Because remember, the U.S. needs to issue debt in order to have dollars in order to spend. So isn't it great that there's legislation that forces agencies like Social Security to buy bonds if they have any extra money? Now, I put extra in quotes because Social Security is probably, according to calculations, going to go defunct, meaning certain people like myself, when it's time for us to retire, there won't be any money in the Social Security coffers for us to access. So that's why I put extra in quotes, because how can there be excess if there's really not enough for everyone who's paying into Social Security to actually access it when they retire? So I thought that this one was interesting. I wanted to show you just an example of how some of that 37 trillion is broken down in terms of one of the more prominent agencies like Social Security. And last, the Federal Reserve banks, right? So as I was saying before, the Federal Reserve as a bank owns quite a bit of U.S. debt. And as you can see, according to this graph, which again, June 3rd, the Fed held about $4.6 trillion of the total debt. So, we're talking somewhere around 10-ish% or so. These numbers are changing so quickly. So about a tenth of all debt that the U.S. has issued, the Federal Reserve owns that amount. Now, what's interesting is you can see, just wanted to point this out, right here, you see this huge spike up? This was effectively COVID, right? So this is if you were watching the Federal Reserve meeting a couple of days ago, Jerome Powell said, when COVID hit, we knew it was going to happen. We were forward looking. We dropped rates to zero and we started quantitative easing. We started adding to our balance sheet. And you can see this on this graph. The Fed drastically printed lots of money and started buying lots of U.S. debt in order to flood the market with new liquidity or new dollars, because the market in and of itself, the economy, was almost shut down. Remember, we couldn't go to work. A lot of businesses were shut down. You couldn't spend your money on certain things because the businesses were shut down, or you couldn't go outside. And so money stopped flowing. Money stopped being generated in a lot of categories. So the Fed stepped in to basically replace that cash that wasn't flowing through the economy through natural kind of processes. They came in and said, we are going to print and try to heal that. The problem is the debt overall increased so drastically that it made things a lot worse. So a lot of the inflation that we're seeing, a lot of the increase in prices, even though this was years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, that's kind of how the economy works. The U.S. economy is so large that policy decisions that might be made today, we may not see the impact of those decisions for years down the line. And so that's what's happening right now. We're seeing the impact of all of this exorbitant money printing. And as I've been saying, the more dollars in circulation, there's kind of two ways to think about this. If you have a ton of dollars that are created out of thin air, the more of anything that you have, the less each one of those individual units is worth, because you have a surplus of the supply. So the more dollars that are created out of thin air, the less each one of those individual dollars are worth. The other way to think about it is if you have an economy that's not growing rapidly, meaning you don't have a ton of new products and services coming to market, but you have a ton of new dollars coming into the market, that means you have more dollars chasing the same amount of products and services. And so it's kind of like if you're selling something and only one person wants to buy, it's like, okay, you may have to haggle with them, right? And they may kind of get you to lower your price because you guys are haggling, going back and forth. But if you have a product and there's a 100-person long line waiting to buy your product, now there's demand, you don't have to lower your price because clearly there are people that are willing to pay the price for your product or service. So it's the same thing. When you have a lot of dollars, and really, if you got 100 people, you may raise your price, right? Because like, man, a lot of people want this. I'm going to raise the price. Like, look at Apple's iPhone. People have definitely showed demand, cult following over the years, and the price of the phone is astronomical now. So it's the same thing with dollars. When there's a ton of these dollars floating in the economy and there's not necessarily a ton of new products or services being created, now you have more dollars per product or service. So that product or service, the nominal price of that product or service goes up because there's higher demand. Higher demand for a product or service, higher price. And in this example, by demand, I mean there's just more dollars floating around that people want to spend. Now, and this also is exacerbated by the fact that when the Fed is flooding the market with all of these dollars, the interest rate is low, right? So if you get all these new dollars and you say, well, I have this new pile of dollars. Am I going to put it in my bank account, in my savings account, and get almost no yield, like 0.1% return? Or am I going to spend it and have fun? Or am I going to try to find yield somewhere else? And that's what we're seeing on this chart. And that's what happened if you were in the stock market or the crypto market at this time, the prices of those assets were going up. There was a huge bull run. There was a dip, but then there was a huge bull run. And I can show you that really quickly. And that happened because people were like, hey, look, I'm not going to get much money from these dollars. And so this is what I wanted to show you. See right here, this was the initial dip. And this is just the S&P 500. It gives a good overview of the market. But see this initial dip? This is what the Fed was trying to fix. And once they started printing money, remember the stimmy checks? Once they started stimulating the economy with those checks and by other methods, the economy had a V-shaped recovery, which you might have heard. It went down and then it shot up super quickly. And that was a result of excess liquidity coming into the market. So I hope that this helps to kind of unpack who the U.S. is in debt to, how this debt is created, and, kind of segmenting what portions of the public or the private institutions and all of that actually hold this debt that the United States has issued. So I hope this helps. If this did, please like, share, subscribe, hit the little bell so when I drop a video, you know that it's out. And definitely leave me comments, questions, respectful rebuttals, whatever in the comments. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Peace.